Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers. Anthony will say something that bores us all silly, and then we'll move on to a better thing. Ant, what's new and exciting in your world this week?
I discovered something that could almost qualify as foolishness of the week. New York's governor has signed first-of-its-kind law cracking down on Bitcoin mining. Specifically, this outlaws Bitcoin mining. Actually, it's a particular type of Bitcoin mining called proof of work. But it outlaws Bitcoin mining within New York State under certain conditions. It's not for individuals. It's for big companies that are mining en masse. And only if you're using non-renewable energy. So if you can show that your energy is coming from solar or wind or something, then it's okay. But if it's coming from non-renewable sources, then all of a sudden you can't do this.
There are so many layers to this that I don't even know where to start peeling.
Here's the thing. Bitcoin mining is really just your computer running a bunch of mathematical equations. Now, the mathematical equations are useful for running the blockchain, but nonetheless, it's just running mathematical equations. I want to point to some other things that have been around for a long time that are somewhat similar. Perhaps the poster child of this is a project that dates back to the early 2000s, SETI at Home. What SETI at Home did is it collects data that came in from the Arecibo radio telescope and processed this data, looking for potential signals from intelligent life in outer space. It was a huge problem, the calculations involved. Rather than get a supercomputer to do this, the problem was cut up into chunks and sent out to what amounted to around 5 million individuals who would run this program on their computer when they weren't using the computer. It would run some calculations and send the results back to the SETI at Home people. It was probably the first example of what today we call distributed computing, but it was the same thing. It was computers running a bunch of calculations that were then sent out somewhere else and aggregated. There's a whole bunch of instances of this, but some of the more popular ones are folding at home, and that's still in process. Data is sent out to a bunch of users, about 5 million of them, where on your personal computer, when you're not using it, it crunches data, sends it back to the folding at home people, and these calculations your computer has performed is used for what's called protein folding, which boils down to better understanding how proteins act in the body, and you can design better drugs or what have you. Coming closer to what Bitcoin mining is a project called GIMPS, the Great Internet Mersenne Prime Search. Here you've got 1 million people currently running programs on their computers that search for prime numbers. Not markedly different from what's going on with Bitcoin mining.
And they call themselves GIMPs.
They call themselves GIMPs, the Great Internet Mersenne Prime Search.
And nobody at the meeting raised a hand and said, maybe we should call ourselves something else.
No.
Maybe this isn't exactly the right thing to call ourselves.
There's already a bunch of things going on, have been going on for a long time, that are in the same ballpark as Bitcoin mining. Furthermore, at its root, Bitcoin mining is simply your computer doing a bunch of calculations. And along comes New York State, outlawing these particular calculations. And that's what this law really boils down to. It's New York State saying that you may not run certain types of mathematical equations on your computer.
I could conceive of a way that the State University of New York system, for example, runs afoul of this law, right? It's conceivable. You start looking at, say, Columbia and their computer science department. Well, they can come up with all kinds of things that would likely violate this law. And here it is, once again, the People's Republic of New York sticking its nose into everybody's business.
It's getting away with it because it's hiding behind environmentalism, saying that, well, they're using this non-renewable energy and this is bad, therefore we're going to ban it.
You put your appliances on the desk, you plug the thing into the wall, you use the power, you pay the bill when it comes. It's not on you where that power comes from.
Yeah, you just said the important words. You pay your bill. These guys are buying electricity just like anybody else buys electricity.
Just like anybody else. That's right. Why is their use of electricity somehow worse than everybody else's?
Well, more than that. What comes next? Can the legislature say, look, we don't like the fact that some of you have electric hot water heaters, so we're going to ban the use of electricity in heating hot water?
Given New York's track record, what they're going to say is, we don't like that so many of you are fat. You can't have refrigerators anymore, unless they're powered by solar.
Hiding behind the environmentalism as well. This is just to promote clean air.
I lived in New York State for 4 years, and I was pretty happy to be on my way out of there, I got to tell you. And, at the time, maybe some of the New York regulators can chime in on this later, but at the time, the wife and I think, had 6 or 7 degrees between us, and we were not allowed, by matter of law, to homeschool our children. Why? Because we didn't have the correct credentials.
Let me say something in New York's defense here.
Do you have to?
If indeed it's the case that truly we are concerned about the environmental impact of non-renewable electricity and so forth, and so we want to do something here, the thing to do is to put a environmental tax on electricity that's generated via fossil fuel. And of course, that's going to hit everybody, but that's part of the point, that if it's bad to use non-renewable energy in Bitcoin mining, it's also bad to use it in all sorts of other things. But this is not what New York is doing. It's singling out this particular application.
No, what they're saying is, we know better than you do what you should tell your computer to do.
Yeah, ultimately, that's it. We're going to tell you how to use your computer. So, sorry, that's not the foolishness, although it is foolish.
I may not be able to catch up to that, but I found something fascinating. Some companies are relaxing their hiring requirements so that a college degree is no longer necessary.
That fascinated me because I've been predicting for a long time that that's coming down the pike.
You and I have been saying this for about 10 years now. A college degree was a credential. Economists have been referring to it as a signaling device for quite some time. I came to believe that that was correct. People earn a degree and then they can wave it about, showing employers that they have a degree. Turns out, all those people who should never have gone to college in the first place, who now have degrees, make very unimpressive job candidates. They aren't decidedly any better off for having it. If you're hiring, why would you bother looking at that group of people? Or only that group of people, probably the better way of putting it. Now, I think it's the case that every barista at Starbucks has a college degree, at least the ones that I've dealt with. Do I really want to use a college degree as a signaling device to tell me that you're better than non-college degree holders if they work at Starbucks? What degree was necessary for that job?
It's not the college degree that matters, it's the college major.
It is, and it's more than that. It's the student who did the studying.
Yes, it's a student who did the studying, and it's also the job that the student ends up in. There are certain jobs out there that you might have a very good degree in whatever the major is, but it's not necessary for the job that you're doing.
I'm happy to see corporations looking around saying, okay, maybe this isn't the place to hang our hat anymore. And good for all the people who didn't go to college, but who are nonetheless very smart, interesting, dedicated people. Right. There's a very big group of them out there. I say they're no more or less admirable than the people who went to college. So if I'm looking to fill a slot and they can do the job, good enough for me. That line of thought, I suspect, is going to open up in strange and unexpected ways.
And all of this was eminently predictable. In fact, we did predict it, that when we ask the government to subsidize the college education, what happens? There's a race amongst universities to admit more and more students because the students don't care as much about what the tuition is because the government's paying the bill. So all of a sudden you've got lots and lots of students coming in and how do you keep those students? You dumb down the curriculum. You make it easy for them. And then you end up in a situation like we are now where 50% of some demographics have college degrees and employers start to ask exactly these questions. If everybody's got this thing, how useful is it?
If the last 10 people I hired had college degrees and 9 of them turned out to be idiots who didn't do the job particularly well.
It actually has a negative effect.
Maybe this isn't the criteria I should be using.
Right.
And I don't know what criteria you do use. I know that Microsoft has a series of mental tests that they give during job interviews, and I think that's really clever.
Well, I've often thought, if you want to look at a college degree as signaling, that is, that I can hold it up and say, I did this, I stuck to it for 4 years, and I have this thing to prove it. If indeed the value of the degree lies in the signaling, there's a much cheaper way to signal. And that's to go to an employer and say, look, I will work for you for free for 1 year just to show you what I can do.
That's illegal.
But it's illegal. How about that?
That's illegal. You can go to school and pay cash for that, but you can't go an apprentice and pay cash for that.
I think over the next couple of decades, we're looking at a retrenchment in universities. Assuming that there is not massive student loan forgiveness, I can easily see half of universities and colleges closing over the next couple of decades. Now, if on the other hand, we get student loan forgiveness, all of that turns on its head.
I suspect that that will be seen by this time next year as a re-election gambit, and that nobody really ever thought that was going to happen anyway. Never underestimate the power of a purely idiotic idea.
I like that.
And that brings us, of course, Ant, to the foolishness of the week. There's this website out there that's called Study Finds. I don't put a whole lot of stock in it, but some of it's really interesting, and you can find a nice rabbit hole or two every time you go there. This time, it's like a burning hot poker shoved right into my stomach. Here's the headline. Morning people are smarter? ? Early risers have higher verbal intelligence debunking previous studies. Well, go yourself, Study Finds. No.
Believe it or not, I saw that article for the first time about an hour and a half ago. I thought, if James sees this, he's really going to be mad.
I am mad. I am pissed off to beat the band. These people, I don't know how many times it has to be illustrated with 100% certainty and clarity that, shall we say, night dwellers, they bring something unique to every table. These are the people who think when the hurriedness of the world subsides.
Right.
When everybody is done complaining about all the things they're going to complain about, and all the cars are off all the roads, and the moon is out in full force, that's when people like me breathe deeply, feel at peace and relaxed, and then do our absolute best work. And there is a cottage industry of dirty like you who are out there explaining to us how defective we are because we don't work 9 to 5. Of course I don't work 9 to 5. And then you throw in a big chunk of, what would be the right word? Prejudice, I guess. Prejudice against introverts into this very mix. And you've just alienated all the people like me.
One of the nice things I've found dealing with you, well, the downside dealing with you is that we have like a 1 or 2 hour window that's common to both of our working schedules.
Yes.
But one of the neat things is I know that if I wake up, and I've done this a number of times, wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning with an interesting idea, I can text James and he'll be up and you'll write back immediately.
I do all my best work at that hour. And then, you throw in the time difference. 3 a.m. for you is 1 a.m. for me, and I'm just having dinner at 1 a.m.
Right, yeah, that's your lunchtime.
Right? I think this one-size-fits-all mentality that we have had for many years is destructive. And I think we're starting to see now that there's a class of people, and I'm certainly in that class, that you can leave alone and just kind of say, look, go deal with it. Your deadline is Thursday. And you get real quality work. And for this, I have COVID to thank.
To get more Ant and James, buy a copy of our excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion. You can find the paper and electronic versions on Amazon and the audio version on Audible. If you'd like to support Words and Numbers, make your way over to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers, where you can contribute to our podcast-making habits. If you'd like to schedule us to come speak at your event, be it corporate or educational, or have James officiate at your wedding, send us an email at wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com. For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. This week's episode was recorded live at the Young America's Foundation's Road to Freedom seminar, held at the Reagan Ranch Center in Santa Barbara, California. Thank you all for being here. I'm Anthony, he's James. We have this podcast, Words and Numbers, that we kind of started just on a lark because my kids said podcasting is the thing to do. And I said...
Wait, they've also recently said TikTok is the thing to do, so careful.
As with Words and Numbers, I'm having to convince James that TikTok is indeed a good idea. We started into this with the intent of just doing a few episodes and talking about life as we see it as an economist and political scientist, and the thing kind of took on a life of its own. We're coming up on our 300th episode. We've come out religiously every single Wednesday, and we've talked about all sorts of things, ranging from economics to social things to current events.
And this will be the first time we ever really have the pleasure of talking about Reagan, one of my heroes, maybe one of yours as well. And that's odd, right? I'm an academic who will cheerfully admit that I think Ronald Reagan was a fantastic president and probably even a more fantastic human being. That has not made me a lot of friends in the academy, as you might imagine.
We want to talk about Ronald Reagan today. James and I were talking about what are we going to talk about for this thing, and said, well, we're here in Santa Barbara at the Reagan Ranch Center, and we should naturally talk about Reagan. And so James is going to take more of the political view. I'm taking more of the economic view. Reagan was always a hero of mine as well, principally because of his economic policies, which were remarkably free market, given what you understand about our history from the 1900s forward in this country. But in doing some research for this talk today, I encountered stuff I didn't know that was just astounding to me. I'll throw out one thing of interest. Of course, you know that Reagan, in his, I guess, both elections, his first term and his second, took the country by landslide. I can recall I was in college at the time looking at this map of the United States as each state was being called for Reagan, or who is he running against the first time?
Why would you ask me that?
Yeah, but every state's going to Reagan. Every single one, I think with the exception of Minnesota and Washington, D.C., went to Reagan. And, you know, being a kid in college, what did I know? It's an election, fine. But in retrospect, particularly thinking about how we do our politics now in this country, it's become so incredibly divisive. The left doesn't like the right, and the right doesn't like the left as voters, and it goes all the way up to the politicians, where the politicians will consider themselves to be whoever wins, the president of this particular half of the country that voted for them, and to heck with the other half. But to see that electoral map go almost entirely for one person was astounding. It was a sign of unity that the country hasn't seen since then. And in fact, and this comes to this research I was doing, it was unprecedented up until that time. If you look at the electoral vote in this country, going all the way back to our founding, only one president earned a greater percentage of the electoral vote than did Ronald Reagan, and that was George Washington.
Who became president with 100% of the
100% of the electoral vote. Ronald Reagan came in averaging his 2 terms, 94%, which is interesting because if you ask people who is the most unifying president in those terms, a lot of people would probably say something like FDR. And FDR was unifying in that sense, which James will probably talk about later. We're living with much of the legacy of that unification. But even so, he averaged 88% of the electoral vote versus Ronald Reagan's 94%. So in terms of unity, Reagan really represented a watershed moment in American politics. And in a lot of ways, the country at the time was very similar to what it is now, at least economically. When Ronald Reagan took office, inflation was at unprecedented levels. It was 10% when he took office. That was the highest it had ever been. When Joe Biden took office, well, not when he took office, but now we're dealing with inflation of above 8%, which is unprecedented, save for when Ronald Reagan took office. Along with the inflation, there's a conflict with Russia going on, which also marked Reagan's time in office. In so many ways, what we're dealing with today economically mirrors what Americans were dealing with when Ronald Reagan took office. And yet, we, politically, psychologically, are markedly different. We're divisive almost to the extent that we were unified back then. If you ask Americans, as Gallup does every year for going back pretty much as long as Gallup has existed, they'll ask Americans, a random selection of them, tell us, what do you think about the country? Do you think it's going in the right direction or is it going in the wrong direction? And of course, as you imagine, the numbers vary. If you're interested, the average number, this is since 1979, the average number of Americans who say, yes, the country's going in the right direction, 34%. That's astounding. From 1979 to the present, 2/3 of us routinely think the country's going in the wrong direction. When Ronald Reagan took office, that number was 17%. 17% of Americans said, yeah, we're going in the right direction.
By his second term, he got that number up to just shy of 70%. Within 2 years, 3 tops, we went from a country in which virtually all of us thought we were heading the wrong direction to a country in which virtually all of us thought we were heading in the right direction. And that almost 70% approval rating, if you want to think of it like that, was only matched one other time in modern times. And that was when Bill Clinton was president during the dot-com boom. Just slightly more, 71% of Americans said we're moving in the right direction. Any idea what percentage think today we're moving in the right direction? Reagan took office, the number was 17%. Today, it's 11.
If there's a stronger indictment against the Biden administration, I don't know what it is. We're sitting here looking at a situation in which we have a sitting president of the United States who is dealing with a number of big picture problems that we've got right now, and yet none of us can say what he's doing. Right? None of us actually know, which leads me to believe we're not doing anything at all, which under certain circumstances is usually what I suggest. Don't just do something, stand there.
Right.
And yet you know that that's not the right answer right this second, that we have the kinds of problems now that are going to have to be addressed, and the political class has decided not to address them at all. And Ant and I made a bit of a sport of this during the last batch of debates. We asked ourselves, okay, how many times do you think all of these people are going to use the words deficit and debt? And the correct answer, you already know it, 0 times.
And that's in all of the presidential debates from the last election. The primaries, the actual debates between the Democrat and Republican, nobody, not once, used those words debt or deficit, and that includes the moderator who's asking the questions.
That's right. You would think that at least somebody might have by accident said the words, and yet they did not. And this is what I want to share with all of you about the Reagan years. I was young when he took office. I was 13. Yet it was still very obvious that we were looking at somebody who really mattered. And it was strange because everybody in the press would tell us that this doddering old man had become president and he's a fool and he's going to get us into World War III. He kept us from getting into World War III. He knew exactly how to deal with the Russians in the Cold War. And he knew how to unite the people behind him. All you ever heard prior to that first election was that, oh, it's pretty sure, it's Carter, by the way, but Carter should run right over him and everything should be fine. And that didn't happen. And then we heard on the news what a bunch of fools we were for electing him into this powerful office. And then 4 years later, the press doubled down on all that same language, and we elected him again by an even wider margin.
Right, yeah.
I mean, I can't even begin to tell you how much people loved him and how much they should have. This was, I think, a love affair that America had for 8 years, and it changed everything. And you start to look back now on the presidents that have been elected in your lifetimes, and they are singularly unimpressive. These are not the people that you look at and say, that's our guy. Matter of fact, I wouldn't want any of them living next door to me, let alone being president of the United States. And yet, for whatever the reason, people just can't look back on the Reagan years and say, we had the right answers then. And yet we did. It's a little confusing how we refused to learn this lesson.
James and I say frequently that it really doesn't matter who wins the presidency. And what we mean by that is you hear these things about people were putting stickers for a while on gas pumps when the price of gas was going so high. It was a little sticker of Joe Biden pointing, saying, I did this. To which we say, no, he didn't, right?
Well, he didn't help.
He didn't help. But presidents don't have that kind of power to be influencing directly like that prices of gas or the unemployment rate or even things like the deficit and the debt. Those things, while the president signs the budget and even drafts the budget, so much of that is under the power of Congress that when you really look at it and you ask, what can a president really actually do as an individual? The answer is pretty much nothing. And yet, here we are, sitting here saying what an interesting and wonderful president Reagan was. He did something. I claim what he did that was so wonderful had nothing to do with his presidential powers. It had to do with a psychology. When he was elected, he said to the American people, first off, all of us are one family. We aren't my side and the other side who we defeated. We're all one family. And furthermore, the key to making America better is to let the people do what they do best. They save, they invest, they make consumption choices, they create businesses. And the best thing that government can do is get out of their way and let them do the thing. One of our favorite quotes of Ronald Reagan was, he said, the 9 most terrifying words in the English language: I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And this is a politician who's saying this. He understood that the key to a vibrant economy, the key to a healthy society, is let the people do their thing. That's not to say that government has no role, but government's role is very specific. It's in setting the rules of the game, enforcing the rules of the game, and leaving the players, that's us, to play the game. And what has changed between then and now is we've now had, good Lord, half a century or so of politicians who've thought the reverse. The key to a vibrant society, the key to a healthy economy is the right policies. Elect me and I'll give you the right policies. And furthermore, another problem is half of you voters over there, you don't know what's good for us. Those people over there do. So that's who I'm going to be paying attention to. The rest of you need to sit down and be quiet. And we alternate that every 4 to 8 years. But what Reagan did is he changed the psyche of the people. We all kind of woke up, and back then, and I was a kid at the time, but during the oil crisis, and we had gas lines where you had to wait in line for gas for hours to buy gasoline in this country. Gas prices were high, and unemployment and recession, all of this stuff, not dissimilar to what we have now. But along comes Reagan and says, look, the key to this is all of you need to do what you do best. Government has to step out of the way. And he said one thing further. He used the phrase morning in America. He said it's morning in America. Things are going to get better. And that affected people's psychologies when they realized that we control our futures and we can make this place better. All that has to happen is government has to step out of the way. And so what happened? That had an effect. All of a sudden, people became more comfortable with the future. And when people become comfortable with the future, several things happen. They start to plan. Because if I'm comfortable that I know what the world's going to look like 5, 10 years down the road, I'm more apt to make plans about what's going to happen in my life around me 5, 10 years down the road. I'm more able to plan for the future. And one of the things that happens when I plan for the future is I become more likely to invest in the future. Maybe I start a business, maybe I invest in education, maybe I make some big ticket purchases, I buy a house, or I decide to have children, or I start to save for retirement. All of these things, Americans start to invest, more than just invest physically, we start to plan about our futures. And that created an economic juggernaut whose effects were felt all the way through the dot-com era of the 1990s and the boom in the 2000s that came off of that. All of that was the echo of what Reagan did for us as an individual. He told us to believe in ourselves, and we took him seriously.
If anything, I think you're underselling it. In the tail end of the Carter years, those last 2 years of the Carter presidency, we were seeing things that Americans had never seen before. We were routinely insulted on the world stage, right? The Iranians had taken a number of our citizens hostage. And every night on the news, they would put that placard up, how many days it was. And it was 444 days.
Yeah.
For well over a year, our people were held by the Iranians and we did nothing. We could have done all kinds of things, and we just didn't. And when Reagan campaigned for the office, he didn't let the bitterness of those sorts of things to infect him. You're right. It was morning or springtime in America, depending on which day of the week you might have caught him. And it still resonates with us. We still remember this, right? Because every Republican who runs for president now places himself relative to Reagan. All the Republicans want to be Reagan's successor. That really tells you something, because at the time, people thought he was nuts. When you think about something like the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the first George Bush tried to take credit for that, and everybody laughed at him. That happened as a direct result of what Ronald Reagan did, and Reagan had a couple of friends that were helpful. That group of 3, Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and John Paul II, they stood against communism, never wavering. You think, well, who would do that today? Can you imagine Joe Biden and Pope Francis, and whoever the hell is prime minister in England now, It's been just a little
They just
bit.
got a new one.
Yeah, that's all I know about that. But can you imagine three people standing together to dismantle something that had defined human misery for the last 50 years?
My guess is you think of the Soviet Union in more fatalistic terms of, well, yeah, it was there and it fell apart and that's that. But to live it, the Soviet Union falling apart would be like the United States falling apart today, how you might think about that.
Yeah,
it's unthinkable.
When I was in first grade, they showed us how to get underneath our desks and cover our heads.
Right.
And apparently that would stop us from becoming vaporized when the nuclear weapons hit.
Right.
When children are brought to that point, the level of fear that people had becomes quite unreasonable. And yet there it was. Every year they would show us how to hide under our desk. You have to contend, I think, that the role the Soviet Union played in world affairs probably more pronounced than people believe right now. It's easy to overlook it now that it's all fallen apart. Or has it? You look at Putin and all the things he's up to right now, and really it's a continuation play. It's not the same, but it is a continuation. And we don't have, I think, the political fortitude right now to deal with that right now.
I started off by saying that I was astounded to find that Reagan's average electoral vote count was second only to George Washington. And there's an interesting second parallel here. I've often thought, and depending on your background, you might attribute this to serendipity or you might attribute it to divine providence, but how interesting it is at the founding that we had so many of the right people in the right place at the right time. Jefferson, Adams, Washington, Franklin. How strange that they all came. And if you take away any one or two of them, you might not have the founding. It was those people at that point in history, at that place geographically, that made that work. And now we come to the 1980s and the subsequent fall in the late 1980s of the Soviet Union. And I think, again, you have this serendipity, or if you want to think of it as divine providence, of the right people at the right place and the right point in history. And that's those three that James mentioned, Reagan, Thatcher, and John Paul II. Each one of them, well, John Paul II didn't have to worry about politics as much as the other two, but the other two pretty much kicked politics in the teeth. And they said, there's a right thing to do here, and we're going to do it. That's not the sort of thing you would think about when you think about modern politicians.
It wasn't that long ago, and yet we have managed to forget what real leadership looks like. Because we've forgotten what it looks like, we failed to demand it. And instead, we play this sports-like game where there are two teams in the country, red and blue, and I'm going to be on one of them, and everybody else on the other side is stupid, wrong, and crazy. And if we continue to do it that way, there's nothing but harm at the end of the road. We are only going to be diminished as a result. We really need to have a view of what appropriate leadership looks like, what we might expect. And it's far, far different than what we now expect.
Yeah, it's markedly different because today when we think about leadership, or at least when politicians think about leadership, their thinking is in terms of directing. They're going to tell us what to do that's going to fix the problem, which is markedly different than doing what Reagan did, which is pointing the way and saying, here's how you fix it. It's in your hands. I believe in you. Go do it. Instead, we get called deplorables if you disagree with whoever's in charge, and the other side uses other words to talk about those who disagree with them. And what has happened, oddly, and I guess predictably from an economic perspective, is that politicians today have learned the secret to getting elected. The secret to getting elected is to stand athwart half the country. If I can get that half of the country to fight with that half of the country, these people are going to be much more likely to elect me because they're mad. They're convinced they're right because I've told them they're right and these people over here are wrong. And what are they going to do? They're going to come out and vote for me because everything depends on me being elected. And my opponent over here, who may or may not actually disagree with me, what we do agree on is splitting the nation like that. And my opponent's going to do the exact opposite and convince these people that those people over there are evil or stupid or whatever it is, and everything rides on you coming out and voting to elect me. And notice what happens. The winner in that game is the politicians. So long as we can keep the voters fighting amongst each other, convincing them that half of them is other, indifferent, and stupid, we keep getting elected. That is the exact opposite of what Reagan did.
I say often that people get the government they deserve. I'm not just thinking about the United States. I'm thinking about everywhere you find government. People generally get the government they deserve. Look at what we've got right now. Because we decided not to care about the things that mattered, instead caring about winning and losing. As long as that's the case, you're never going to have the government you want. You're just going to have the government you deserve. Now, I'm not saying that winning and losing aren't important things. They absolutely are. But you really need to begin at the level of a single idea. What animates you politically? And in the United States, the correct answer to that question has always been equality. Jefferson gives us this in the Declaration of Independence. Is that sufficient? No, but it's enough to get started. What's the animating thought that we have today? I honestly have no idea. I know that we have a few, and Democrats and Republicans will have different ones, which means we're already at a point where nothing's going to work out all that well.
Yeah, and I think too often the animating thought is, what can I get out of the government? What's the government going to do for me, be it healthcare or education or jobs or what have you? Much less often do we look to ourselves.
Well, don't forget paying off student loans.
No, paying off student loans,
That's a
right?
big deal, too.
Yeah, I think this crowd might like that.
Maybe not. When you look at government handouts, when those are the first thing that people think about, trust me, you've already lost this game.
Right, yeah.
You've got to change that. You've got to change that fast.
And Reagan was a fan of Milton Friedman's, and Milton Friedman is one of the economists, and there are many of us now, who our mantra is the best thing the government can do is get out of the way. Set the rules, leave us alone. We're the ones that create jobs. We're the ones that reduce unemployment. All the politicians have to do is let us do our thing.
You have to remember that he was an optimist. And he wasn't the regular kind of optimist.
He wasn't a Pollyannish.
No, but he was aggressively optimistic. It permeated his entire character. And there was something about that that was exactly right given the job he held. Mm-hmm. I never get the sense that presidents love the United States. And maybe they do, maybe they don't, but it doesn't resonate. Nobody ever doubted Reagan on that count. You knew that the United States was, for him, the greatest country in the history of countries. I like that. I think maybe we shouldn't dial it up as loud as we do from time to time. But if I had to choose between presidents loving the country or not loving the country, I'm going with loving every time. And what else did he do? He referred to the Soviet Union as an evil empire. And he said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And then the wall came down. He was right the whole time. If you could know anything, if you could remember anything, I think that short 3-item list, whatever you're looking at right now, trust me, we've faced it before and we did better.
That's a good place to stop, and we're going to open to Q&A.
That's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Be sure to join us next week when we talk about other things. And hey, send it out to your friends, for crying out loud. Where are the link shares happening? I don't see any of them. So lean on your friends to subscribe to.
That's right. Forward our episodes around to friends and family.
Yeah, and all those people we talked about in New York State. Send it off to them. We'll be back next week. And until then, will you just be nice to each other? And I know it's especially hard in between Thanksgiving and Christmas, but if you offered yourself as a bulwark against that, if you stood up and said, here and no further, I'm going to be nice to all of you, maybe we would see a change we'll never know until we try. Be nice to each other, even if it's remarkably painful.